Hi, I'm Eric Humphrey, and together with Dwight Singler, we've just completed this book, Growth, Modernity, and the Nations of Wealth, that deals with the question of how the modern world happened, how the West became rich. And we were giving a lecture the other day about chapter 3 on modernity and how we define it. And after the lecture, someone came up to us and asked us about our distinctions between an allegorical mentality and a factual mentality, because we use this to show you how the modern world has changed us. And it's a great question. So today's topic is going to be about those two mentalities and what they mean about the modern world. And to illustrate this, we're going to ask the question whether you believe in ghosts or not. That's the basic idea. So what do I mean by a ghost? Well, first of all, a ghost is just a spirit, Anglo-Saxon Geist or German Geist, that is, we enter into some sort of relationship. It's an intention out there, and we do deals with it. So this is my office ghost. This lives on my desk. His name is Jake. He keeps my desk clean. He keeps the updates down, my pen's flowing, and in return, this is Jake's bowl, I give him one yellow M&M. So you get the basic idea of what a ghost is. I do a deal with him. Jake is an intention. I satisfy that intention. My desk works. But don't give him the green M&Ms. Ghosts don't like that ectoplasmic green stuff. Anyway, so we now know what the anatomy of a ghost is. So importantly, a ghost can be any size. It can be very small, this little one for my desktop, or Christ, Jesus, God Almighty. They can be as big as you can imagine, but it seems rather gratuitous to use the God of the known universe to help me with my desk. So most spirits are kind of small and manageable. Morally speaking, ghosts can be either good or evil. That's why I like the older Anglo-Saxon or German definition of a ghost as just a spirit. But after the Norman conquests, Anglo-Saxons, ghosts became ghostly and Latin spirits became spiritual. But here, there's no real moral distinction. Ghosts make the world intentional, and that's what's important. They represent reality in an intentional way. And then once reality speaks in this way, we can do deals with it. Ghosts teach us lesson. So they mediate reality with a personality with which we can enter into a relation. I can exchange food. Oops, there's his meal. I can exchange food with a ghost, or I can exchange my moral behavior with a ghost to help control reality. So this must be something like a default setting in human nature, that most of our problems as humans stem from other intentional beings, namely other humans, but we end up defaulting to want to deal with our problems in an intentional metaphor. So what does this have to do with what we called the factual and the allegorical mentality? Well, let's look at an example of a factual and an allegorical interpretation with one passage that's the exact same. So I want you to listen carefully to this passage. I jumped up from bed, looked at the clock. Late again. Immediately, I rushed over to the kitchen sink and splashed water on my face. And there, brushing its whiskers up against the glass, right above the sink in the window, was a big yellow cat. I paused. Now, in an allegorical interpretation, that is, this is created by an intention, this passage was written by a famous, I'm speculating here, Nobel Prize winning, Pulitzer Prize winning author, X. And we're in our English class, and our English professor says, what does the yellow cat symbolize? What does it mean? And it's fair to ask this question. So someone says, oh, it's a distraction. No, he should stop and pet the cat. He should relax. And it's fair to ask this kind of question in this passage because the god of the pages, also known as the author, wrote this. And that author had choices. He could have put no cat in the window. Or if he was a magic realist like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, he could have put a talking spider monkey trying to bum a cigarette. So we can ask what the cat means. Now let's take the exact same passage that I read you and interpret it through what we call a factual mentality. That is, a mentality that's more conducive to the way a scientist would look at the world. Now, this very same passage is a diary entry of Max Borgen on July 11th, 1981. And I say to you, not as your English professor, what does the yellow cat mean in this diary entry? And you look at me like I'm a complete idiot. It doesn't mean anything. It's just fact flow, one damn thing after another, no allegory whatsoever. And he says, ironically, don't be so superstitious, for God's sake. So what's going on here is a shift between the mentalities that we use to interpret reality. And it's impossible not to notice, and the book notices, in the last 300 to 500 years, that ghosts and spirits have retreated a great deal from our life and how we use and explain things. But what we need to see is that both of these mentalities, the factual one and the allegorical one, are strategies to control reality. The allegorical reality uses intentions, authors, gods, spirits, and we try to propitiate, to satisfy those intentions. Whereas the other way of understanding, the scientific way, relies on understanding the world as natural, inanimate mechanism. So what are the consequences of this, of these two allegorical, or these two mentalities? What does this mean? Well, consider the case of Wolfgang Schmidt. He's born in southern Germany in the year 1526, and then again, the same Wolfgang Schmidt is born in 2026. But only Wolfgang is mad, stark raving mad, insane, crazy. And this is not Monty Python, Michel Foucault, village idiot kind of harmless stuff. He's dangerous. He bites, hits, and spits. And the elders are at their wits' end of dealing with him. So they call in the priest. It's 1526. The priest thinks he can solve Wolfgang's problem. He goes into the hut with Wolfgang, comes back bitten and beaten. He then tells the elders that Wolfgang is doing deals with the devil. It's later determined that Wolfgang must be burned at the stake that sunny, wintered evening. So, ouch. That's a pretty radical solution for Wolfgang. But now fast forward to 2026. The very same Wolfgang with the very same malady is born in the great German national healthcare insurance, and he's diagnosed very early on as having a neurochemical disorder. He's medicated for that. And now he works in Der Wiener Schnitzel. So, not bad. So, which Wolfgang is better? The one in 1526 in the allegorical mentality, or the one in 2026 with the factual mentality? Well, our inner control freak is going to say, well, it's just much better to not be burned at the stake. That seems a little bit excessive. But what are the consequences? If Wolfgang is not doing some sort of allegory with the cosmos between God and man or good and evil, what are the consequences of Wolfgang simply being a chemical imbalance? By not burning Wolfgang at the stake, we entered a world with different kinds of consequences. If it's not an allegory between good and evil by an intentional spirit or God of some sort, but it's just a chemical imbalance, say what you will about burning at the stake, but at least in a universe where you burn Wolfgang at the stake, a village knows where it stands. And if the first fallacy of human egoism is to think that the world hates us, surely the second fallacy of human egoism is to think that it loves us. Because in the factual mentality of modern science, the world just doesn't care. And precisely this trade-off between an allegorical mentality, more common in the pre-modern period, and a factual mentality, more common now, reveals a secret kind of counter-revolution afoot in Western intellectuals against the scientific revolution that we're supposed to all be in favor of. So why is there this war? Well, we can see it everywhere. Most obviously in the philosophers like Descartes and Kant, who try and create this wall of separation between what science can do and what human dignity, the soul, and self-consciousness demand. But this division is in Hegel, Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, most of the leftist thinkers. Indeed, even in the social sciences and humanities today, there's a really strong resistance to the encroachments of people like E.O. Wilson, sociobiology, or Gary Becker, a Chicago school economist, in explaining more sacred matters. And this is the crux of the issue. Because if poor Wolfie is just a neurochemical imbalance, in such a world you no sooner need an exorcism or an analyst than your toaster needs a life coach. Okay, your toaster needs a new heating element, you need a neurochemical tune-up. That's the trade-off that we're dealing with here. And that trade-off, the triumph of this factual mentality, has relegated thinkers like Descartes and Kant, Hegel, Marx, and Freud to English departments. The fate of all allegorists is to end up in the halls of English and humanities departments. These people wanted to be scientists, but they weren't willing to go the extra mile. So this rise of a factual mentality at the expense of an allegorical mentality reveals that what we're dealing with is a kind of logic of control. And this is likely the fault of the original spirits themselves. And that is, for most human beings, meaning was control. So they didn't distinguish between these things. But that made the spirits look pretty unspiritual. They were always about very corporeal matters, not dying, fertility, longevity. We do these things with doctors and agribusiness now. But this brings us to the real divine dilemma with ghosts, spirits. And that is, we want a supernatural deity alien enough and powerful enough to save us, but not so alien and powerful as not to care. That's the big dilemma we have to solve. And this tension that we see, especially in the modern world, with the rise of a factual mentality conducive to science, is why we watch this retreat of the ghosts and spirits to the margins of reality, or English departments. They're moving off reality. The paranormal sciences are a science of the future and always will be. They'll be pushed out to the margins. But to explain this, we also want to avoid a kind of continental European intellectual overthink. And that is, we don't want to overthink the problem. We don't want to do Heidegger's version of a rebellion against creation, being. We don't want to do an evil dialectic of reason that's a sort of trapping itself, Weber's iron cage, or even a psychic drama between Freud's gnomes and the skull. And we certainly don't want to do what the academic Marxists are trying to do, and that is rescue Marxian fairy tale by adding more gnomes from Max Weber and Sigmund Freud. There's no inner dialectic of reason. There's not even a culture of science that's driving this. And that is to explain the persistence and triumph, or the predominance, of this allegorical mentality. Remember, we're just talking about proportions of our mind. That is, we lean more toward an allegorical or more toward a factual mentality. But to explain the predominance of the factual mentality, we have to explain not how you come up with scientific ideas, but how societies hold and sustain these ideas over time. The trick is not to come up with an idea. The trick is to hold an idea and maintain it. This is what our book tries to explain when it tries to understand what the modern world is. And in this line, we can avoid this intellectual overthink in trying to explain the character of our modern world. And that is, I think, Hirohito, the defeated Japanese emperor in World War II, explains this transition best. And that is, he told his son, who would become the future Akihito, our generals believed too much in spirit and neglected science. In other words, we don't need to overthink the problem of what this rationalization is that's causing the deanimation of reality. We don't need to overthink it like Hegel, Heidegger, Marx, and Freud. And that is, the Japanese and the Chinese rationalized and deanimated reality for the same reason that the French learned calculus from the English. And that is, it was simply too painful to think otherwise. And that is, in retrospect, the spirits have tended to be bad scientists. And that, I think, was Hirohito's point to his son. But that then leaves us with a real conundrum that can be stated in the following way. I call this the pill and the sutra dilemma. And that is, in my hand, I hold you deoxyblisohapamine, better known by its over-the-counter name as Nirvani. This chemical will give you the brain chemistry balance of a Buddha. Now, we can do this the easy way with the pill. This is the best way to get control. Or we can do this the hard way, the old-fashioned way, this old sutra. And if you read through this sutra, and it's in Pali, and it's got all kinds of weird conjectural meanings, they're not quite understood, and your legs are getting numb in the lotus position, and it's going to say something like, we're positing identities that don't really exist, and that's why suffering is caused. But it took the Buddha many lifetimes to really appreciate that, and one full lifetime to bring it home. Or if you don't like that approach, you can try this other musty approach. It's a Christian prayer book and a Jewish prayer book, and it's going to say something like, there's nothing out there as big as your desire. You're never going to get over this, but if you hang around with like-minded people, you will get used to it. So just repeat these incantations. Or there's Nirvani. So what's it going to be? This is the dilemma. Now, my inner economist, who says that this is just a scientific optimization problem, says, take the pill. Take the pill, dump the sutra. But if you do that, you risk losing your status as a serious organism. if all you are is chemical imbalance, suffering is merely suffering. There's nothing redeeming it. There's nothing allegorical about it. And this is why we see this fundamental modern dilemma. The ghosts have retreated, but they've not been defeated in reality. Because at bottom, there's a tragic and profound dilemma worthy of the best Greek mythology. And that is, there's a trade-off in our exchange for control, for meaning. And we were fatally untragic in not seeing that these two are in conflict. And that's what you need to know about Chapter 3's notion of an allegorical mentality and a factual mentality, and how this modern world has revolutionized our mind. Thank you. Okay.